So a few months ago, we did a video on social media, specifically short format social media. And we looked at some studies, looked through some data, and found some pretty interesting information. Drew some pretty daunting conclusions about what social media, especially apps like TikTok, might be doing to our minds and the minds of our youth in this day and age. So recently I came across some even more information that adds some context and adds some statistics in light of some of the things we've already been talking about on this channel. And it's specifically aimed around right now TikTok, because TikTok is probably definitely one of the most popular apps around the world. And one of the statistics even we have pulled up here, I want to say it's over a billion users, but it's like 1.5, 1.8 billion users total. Which, if you think about that, the fact that that percentage of the world population is actively using TikTok is absolutely wild. And I guess just jumping right into some of the studies and some of the articles that we have pulled up here, kind of just want to talk through the data based on the order in which I found it. And I have some notes here, but the one we're on right now, it's worth pointing out. So just for some context about like the true engagement of these social media platforms on a daily basis, right here it says, as of January 2023, the app had been downloaded 3.5 billion times. So even with a large margin for inactive users, re-downloads, stuff like that, that implies a massive user base as recently as end of 2023. 43% of the global audience of TikTok is ranged from 18 to 24, and 32% are aged 25 to 34. But a misleading part of those numbers is the fact that underage users are not accounted for within these statistics, because that 13 to 17 or even younger, like probably 9, 10 to 17 range age group, it's not included in these statistics or this survey. But following that, they do include an estimate based on another statistic that they have, being half of children from 3 to 17 use TikTok in 2021. And now that is insanity. That range goes all the way down to 3. They also found that 4 out of 10, so 2 and 5 or 40% of 5 to 16-year-olds use TikTok on a daily basis. And that is most likely the most concerning statistic, because that's by far going to be the most impressionable age group. And if it's being used on a daily basis, what is happening is they are building these open-ended feedback loops into their neural network starting from a very young age. And if that habit is being reinforced every day, and it is a consistently open-ended feedback loop, meaning when they're scrolling and when they're being essentially bombarded with this input, all this information and sensory input in the form of text, videos, music, just completely random and chaotic information, there's no progression for that. There's nothing that builds off of itself. There's no narrative that's formed. There's no ideas that are really dived into. It's a very, very surface level sort of engagement. I mean, it's a surface level behavior in general, because at the end of the day, most of the time, it is just mindless scrolling. And the content that you're being shown is perpetually being made more efficient by the content that you interact with. So it's like a self-feeding cycle. And even though everyone is sort of aware of what's happening and aware of the algorithm that they are locking themselves into, they're okay with it because they are being fed this content that they find engaging and entertaining, even if it's on a very, very superficial level. It works, and it is incredibly addictive. But part of the problem is when it comes to addiction, part of the barriers and part of the guardrails for preventing addiction, like it or not, is stigma, and is social stigma, and is the social perception of maybe a person and a person's integrity if they are addicted to something like a drug. But with TikTok, the stigma is very different, because the stigma is almost non-existent, because not everyone, but because a vast majority of people, they have a smartphone, they downloaded TikTok, It happens to be on their phone, and over time, they found themselves opening up the app more and more, scrolling more and more, and before they know it, it's a subconscious ritual that they're engaging in. They're opening up the app and just scrolling, and now it's something that they have to do. They can't not do, because that's like that dopaminergic expectation is baked into what you're anticipating for at least an hour a day based on these statistics right here. And it's probably more than that. These are probably underrepresented numbers. Lastly, just to kind of top off that statistic there, give you an even clearer picture, half of all girls, 48%, use TikTok on a daily basis, compared to 1 in 3 boys, 34%. So even a third of all boys, males, using this app on a daily basis, and half of all females, like that alone should be somewhat alarming number to see. Now, the next part of this phenomenon and the reason that it's dangerous has to do with mental health and the mental health awareness, quote unquote, side of TikTok and short format content in general. Because what you've seen, and if you're on these apps, you know what I'm talking about, you see a kind of trend towards people who they aestheticize, almost romanticize this idea of mental health illness and mental health labeling. And what they'll do, you'll find these pages and these channels and these users, influencers, if you will, they're dedicated solely to supposedly raising awareness around these mental illnesses and these mental illness labels. But what it really is not to be too extreme, but it's almost like a hypochondriac. It's a hypochondrian cult where they kind of feed off these people who are almost subconsciously looking for a label to fit into or a identity to adopt if there's something in their life they can't explain that might have to do with mental health. And a massive one is the ADHD diagnosis. And this one is a vicious cycle because what you're getting on TikTok is you are engaging in a behavior, in a practice that is promoting, like directly promoting symptoms that you have with something like ADHD, especially the attention span aspect. So, right here, based on one study from the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry 2 years ago, analyzed the top 100 most popular videos about ADHD on the platform. And this study determined that over half of these videos were medically misleading, according to their classification. 27% were based entirely on personal experience, and only 21% were considered useful when compared against diagnostic criteria. So that last one right there, if only a fifth of these videos, these mental health videos, and this is in the domain of ADHD, but you can probably assume that there's going to be similar things happening and similar types of misleading content. But ADHD specifically, if only a fifth of those videos would be considered useful relative to an actual medical diagnosis, you can say pretty confidently that this phenomenon is having a negative effect on how these people are engaging and thinking about mental health, especially when it comes to learning about themselves. So what you can guess and what you can kind of conject is going to happen is you're going to see a large growing number of people self-identifying with these labels like ADHD, and the psychological effect of what that does is it also boxes them into feeling like they have to identify with these symptoms and with these criteria. So there's a selection bias that's introduced, and they start observing these symptoms that might even be marginal or non-existent when they kind of enter this rabbit hole, and just based on the way they're engaging with it, these symptoms manifest over time. And then they're on TikTok scrolling through these ADHD related mental health videos, and that alone is is reinforcing the very effects that they're kind of now hyper aware of. So, like I said, a very vicious cycle that you can be a very smart, very intelligent person and still find yourself getting roped into that. Another study analyzed 500 TikTok videos with hashtags mental health tips and mental health advice. Then that study concluded that 83.7% of mental health advice on TikTok is misleading, with almost 15 including content that could be potentially damaging. So that lends itself directly to the other study. And it's safe to say, based on those two, that the vast majority of advice, so called advice on these apps, is not advice that's aligned with your best interest or reality necessarily, or what a qualified medical professional might say, even if qualified medical professionals aren't right 100% of the time. TikTok influencers certainly aren't right 100% of the time. And we just said this, so we won't harp on it too much. But right here, they explain the self-diagnosis phenomenon that we talked about. One of the more alarming potential consequences of the spread of misinformation is the rise in self-diagnosis. This has seemingly led to a wave of young people diagnosing themselves with everything from minor neurosis to full-blown psychosis, sometimes at the expense of seeking a formal diagnosis. So exactly what we're saying, what's happening is a sacrificial, basically a sacrificing of what we would consider a medical consensus in favor of this pop therapy. And then you can always make the argument that when you're looking at an issue like this of like established academic science, so to speak, studies, case studies, peer-reviewed journals and articles, that sort of thing, that there's always room to be skeptical, and I 100% agree. But I think when it comes to some of this data and some of these things that we can observe and deduce, they speak for themselves, and you don't have to think too deeply to acknowledge whether it might have really bad effects. So, just to touch on a couple more things, I think we've looked at the study before, but this is in the journal of the National Library of Medicine. And this study concluded that, well, it actually coined a term, TikTok use disorder, which is essentially TikTok addiction. And they found that it's positively linked to memory loss, depression, anxiety, and stress. And those three, depression, anxiety, and stress, are positively linked to memory loss themselves. So that's the basic conclusion. There's a gender difference in this TikTok use disorder, and that reflects the difference in usage based on gender that we looked at in the last study. So it's adding up, and it's not looking good. And a couple other statistics worth pointing out is, like we said earlier, about the attention span. So there were studies back in the early 2000s and the early 2010s that were already showing a reduction in attention span for all people, including adults, seemingly correlated with the rise of traditional social media sites like Facebook, which now has, I want to say, 3 billion users. That's a crazy number in itself. So this was the interview done with a psychologist here, and this refers to the studies that I just mentioned. So back in 2004, they did an attention span study, and they found it to be 2.5 minutes on average, right? And when they talk about like attention span and how they're gauging that, they talk about it in terms of like what it takes to do a basic task or a normal task averaged out across your day based on all of your daily activities. So in 2004, that was 2.5 minutes on average. By 2012, that was reduced to 75 seconds. So basically having the attention span in an 8-year period, which you can probably see, or you can probably hypothesize just the snowball effect that has on the things you do and how efficient you are on a daily basis. Then by in the last 5-6 years, because this study is a couple years older, or this interview is a couple years older, they found it most recently to be 47 seconds. So it went from a couple minutes to 75 seconds to 47 seconds as of a few years ago, and we wouldn't be surprised if it's lower. They found the median to be 40 seconds, which might even be a better measurement. But it's looking at the number and thinking about the reasons behind that drastic shift. It should not be too difficult to understand why this is happening. And you hear people say it. Most people are completely aware of this type of content having a negative effect on them. But I think the problem is people don't realize how much of an effect it has. And because it's consistently providing these dopamine hits, that you're not really closely observing some of the negatives that manifest or like arise in the long term in the form of reduced attention span and in the form of memory loss. And these things manifest indirectly too in a reduced motivation to educate yourself and to learn about history and to read books, because you can't do those things if you're spending an hour and a half a day on TikTok. And this isn't, there's no shame, there's no judgment, because we all do it. Like, everyone finds themselves scrolling. But what you have to do is you have to, in those moments where you kind of catch yourself acting subconsciously, logging into these apps and just, you don't even realize you're doing it, that's when you have to consciously deviate from the path of least resistance and just say, okay, I'm just gonna stop this. Unless you have a specific purpose, maybe you're opening videos with a friend, maybe you're learning about a specific topic, or like following a specific creator. I mean, there's plenty of reasons. There's plenty of valid reasons to spend time on these apps, but the thing to be aware of is the ritual and whether or not you are becoming dependent on scrolling just for your base existence, because it does have negative effects. And unless we start evolving around technology pretty quickly here, I think they're going to get worse and worse. And I think the consequences are going to start to become more and more apparent as we progress generationally. And as each generation that's born into this world of technology grows up, and we start to see how functional they are relative to maybe past generations, who knows, maybe it's better, but I'm guessing the attention span and memory loss effects alone are going to be noticeable. So that's it. I mean, I'll link these studies and you guys can check them out for yourself, because there's some other interesting data and statistics there worth diving into for sure. But this is a point that, if there's anything on this channel that we definitely stand by, it is that the direction we're heading with media engagement and consumption is probably in the wrong direction. And there's probably a happy medium between this short form content and like only long form content all the time. But this addictive cycle that so many people now, arguably hundreds of millions of people, are finding themselves drawn into, well, there has to be a threshold where we say, okay, maybe this is not a good thing to be entertaining as a collective, and we have to start raising awareness about what these effects are going to be. So, if there's anything that you guys disagree with or have to add, let me know. Leave a comment. But this kind of the theme of this video, like what we're trying to convey here, that's really an extension of the theme of this channel, which is if you have these habits that you have found yourself in, it's always worth a little bit of reflection to figure out if there's something you can be doing, something you can change, that's going to make you, well, just a more valuable person, more valuable citizen, or even if it's not a citizen, just a more valuable person for your friends and family, and for yourself and your future. So, all right, guys, thanks again. I'll see you at the next video.